On a quiet Monday morning, Margaret Hill arrived at the office 10 minutes earlier than usual. Not because she had to. After 30 years in the same building, Margaret rarely rushed. She knew the rhythm of the place better than anyone. She knew which lights flickered before fully turning on, which elevator liked to pause between floors, and which coffee machine in the break room needed a gentle tap before it would start brewing. For 3 decades, Margaret had been part of the quiet machinery that kept the company moving. And like every other morning, she carried the same brown leather bag she had owned for years. Inside it were the familiar things, her reading glasses, a small notebook filled with tidy handwriting, and a fountain pen she had used so often that the grip had worn smooth. Margaret greeted the security guard at the front desk with a warm smile. "Good morning, Alan." Alan looked up from his newspaper and smiled back. "Morning, Margaret. You're early again." She chuckled softly. Old habits. Margaret stepped into the elevator, pressing the button for the 4th floor. The elevator hummed upward slowly, just as it always did. When the doors opened, the hallway was still quiet. Most of the office lights were off. The air carried that early morning stillness that only appears before the workday begins. Margaret walked to her desk near the entrance of the office floor. It wasn't a large desk. In fact, it had always been placed slightly to the side of the main hallway, near the glass doors that separated the executive offices from the rest of the building. But Margaret had never minded. From that desk, she could see everything. The comings and goings, the rushed conversations before meetings, the worried expressions of managers preparing for presentations. She knew when a client had arrived before anyone else did. She knew when someone needed a document before they even asked. Her desk had become something like a quiet control center for the entire company. Margaret placed her bag gently under the desk and opened her notebook. Inside were pages filled with small, careful notes, meeting reminders, client preferences, phone numbers, little details that rarely appeared in official systems but often saved the day when things went wrong. She began writing the day's schedule on a small notepad. 10:00 a.m. client call with Westbrook Logistics. 11:30 a.m. budget meeting in conference room B. 2:00 p.m. contract review with Northern Supply. All things she had prepared for over the past few days. All things she had quietly organized so the company could move forward without interruption. Margaret finished writing and placed the note where the management team would see it when they arrived. For a moment she looked around the office. 30 years. 30 years of mornings just like this one. Sometimes, Margaret wondered how time could move so quietly. She had watched entire teams come and go. Young employees had started their careers here, nervous and uncertain, and later left as confident professionals. New managers had arrived with bold ideas. Some succeeded, some disappeared after a year or two. But Margaret remained, not loudly, not dramatically, just steadily, like the quiet ticking of a clock. At 8:17 a.m., the office phone rang. Margaret answered immediately. "Good morning, Hill and Carter Industries." A familiar voice responded. "Margaret, it's Thomas. Can you remind me what time the client meeting is today?" Margaret smiled slightly. 10 o'clock. "Thomas, conference room B. I've already prepared the documents." "Oh, good," he replied with relief. "I'd probably forget my own schedule without you." Margaret laughed softly. "Well, that's what I'm here for." She hung up the phone and made a small note in her book. Moments later, 2 managers walked past her desk. "Morning, Margaret." "Morning." Another familiar exchange. Another ordinary moment. But that morning was not going to stay ordinary. At 8:30 a.m., an email notification appeared on Margaret's computer screen. A message from Human Resources. Subject: meeting request. Margaret adjusted her glasses and opened it. The message was short. Please come to conference room A at 9:00 a.m. for a brief discussion. Margaret blinked once. Conference room A was usually reserved for executive meetings. It wasn't where HR conversations normally happened. Still, Margaret didn't worry. After 30 years in the company, unexpected meetings were not unusual. Sometimes HR needed help locating old files. Sometimes they needed background information about long-standing clients. Margaret had become something of an unofficial historian for the company. So she closed the email calmly and continued working. The office slowly filled with the sounds of a normal morning. Footsteps in the hallway, phones ringing, coffee cups clinking against desks. At 8:55 a.m., Margaret closed her notebook and stood. She smoothed the front of her cardigan and walked down the hallway toward conference room A. Inside the room sat two people, the HR manager and one of the newer directors. Margaret stepped inside with her usual gentle smile. "Good morning." The HR manager gestured toward a chair. "Please." "Margaret, have a seat." Margaret sat down. The door closed behind her. For a brief moment, no one spoke. The HR manager cleared her throat. "We'll keep this brief." Margaret nodded politely. Then the words came, carefully phrased, but impossible to misunderstand. "Margaret, the company is restructuring. Your position is no longer necessary." The sentence hung in the air. Margaret blinked slowly. 30 years, and the conversation lasted less than 10 minutes. No anger, no raised voices, just a few printed papers, a quiet explanation, and a cardboard box waiting for her belongings. Margaret packed her desk carefully. Her notebook, her pen, a small framed photo of her son from years ago. One by one, the items disappeared into the box. Employees walked past her desk throughout the morning. Most assumed she was reorganizing something. A few waved casually. None of them realized they were watching the final moments of a career that had lasted 3 decades. At 9:42 a.m., Margaret carried the box to the elevator. Alan at the front desk looked up in surprise. Heading out early today, Margaret smiled softly. "Yes." She paused for a moment, then added quietly, "Just a change of plans." The elevator doors closed, and Margaret Hill left the building for the first time in 30 years. The office continued as usual. Phones rang. Meetings began. Coffee machines hummed. Everything looked perfectly normal. But within 2 weeks, something strange would begin happening inside that building. Meetings would be missed. Clients would grow frustrated. Important details would begin slipping through the cracks. And slowly, quietly, the entire company would begin asking the same question. Why is everything suddenly falling apart? Because the truth was something no one in that office had realized yet. The quiet woman, who had just walked out of the elevator, had been holding the entire company together. 2 weeks after Margaret left, the office still looked the same. The same gray carpet, the same glass conference rooms, the same rows of desks filled with computers and paperwork. At first glance, nothing had changed. People still arrived every morning with coffee cups in their hands. Meetings still appeared on calendars. Phones still rang throughout the day. And yet something subtle had begun to shift. It started with small things, the kinds of things most people don't notice at first. A meeting room that hadn't been prepared. A client who arrived 5 minutes early and waited in the hallway because no one knew he was coming. A missing document that someone swore had been printed the day before. Little inconveniences. Little disruptions. At first, Everyone blamed the usual suspects: busy schedules, new software updates, miscommunication. After all, companies survived much bigger changes than losing a secretary, or at least that's what people assumed. But the truth was, Margaret had never really been just a secretary. For 30 years, she had been something else entirely. A quiet observer, a careful organizer, a living memory of everything the company had ever done. She knew things no system could store, things that only came from years of paying attention. Margaret knew that Mr. Hollingsworth from Westbrook Logistics hated afternoon meetings. She knew that the purchasing director at Northern Supply preferred printed contracts instead of digital ones. She knew which executives tended to forget their schedules, and which ones liked to review documents twice before signing. These weren't big things. They weren't written in company manuals. But together, they created something invisible: a smoothness, a rhythm, a sense that everything was always under control. And most people never noticed, because when something works quietly for years, people forget it's working at all. Margaret herself had never thought much about her role. To her, it was simply a job, a steady job, a reliable job, the kind of job that allowed her to build a life after everything she had lost years earlier. Her house sat on a quiet street about 20 minutes from the office. It wasn't large, but it had a small garden behind it, where Margaret spent many of her evenings tending to roses and lavender. Every morning before work, Margaret followed the same routine. She would wake up early, boil water for tea, open the kitchen window to let the fresh morning air inside, and sit quietly at the table with her notebook. That same small notebook she carried to the office every day. Inside it were pages filled with reminders, birthdays of long-term clients, notes about contracts, tiny observations she had made over the years. Margaret never thought of these notes as important. They were simply helpful, a way to stay organized, a way to make sure no one else had to worry about details. Because Margaret had always believed something simple: if I take care of the small things, everyone else can focus on the big ones. It was a philosophy she had followed for most of her life. And for 30 years, it worked back at the office. However, things were beginning to feel different. On a Wednesday morning, Thomas, the same manager who had once called Margaret to ask about a meeting, stood in the hallway staring at his phone. "Does anyone know where the Westbrook presentation is?" he asked. No one answered immediately. Someone eventually replied from across the room. "I thought you had it." Thomas frowned. "I asked for it yesterday." "Well, maybe it's on the shared drive." 10 minutes passed, then 15. The meeting with Westbrook Logistics began with half the documents missing. The client was polite about it, but the conversation felt awkward, unprepared, incomplete. Later that afternoon, another small problem appeared. The finance department realized they had forgotten to send a contract renewal reminder. The deadline had already passed. The client would now need to approve an extension. Again, a small problem. But small problems have a strange habit of multiplying. By the end of the week, the office felt slightly off balance. Not chaotic, not broken, just unsettled. Like a clock that had lost one small gear. Still ticking, but not quite on time. Employees began asking quiet questions in the hallway. "Didn't Margaret used to handle this?" "I think Margaret kept those records." Margaret probably knew where that file was. The more people said her name, the more something began to dawn on them. Margaret had been involved in far more than they realized. Meanwhile, Margaret herself was adjusting to a very different kind of life. For the first time in 3 decades, she didn't wake up to an alarm clock. She didn't rush to catch the elevator before the morning meeting. She didn't prepare schedules for people who often forgot to thank her. Instead, She spent her mornings in the garden. The roses had begun to bloom that spring. Margaret moved slowly between the flower beds, trimming branches and watering the soil. It was peaceful work, quiet work. Sometimes she even wondered if this new life might be simpler, better. Perhaps, but every now and then, she would pause, look at the notebook resting on the patio table, and think about the office she had left behind, about the rhythm of the place, about the people who had depended on her more than they realized. And sometimes she would ask herself a quiet question. Did any of them notice yet? Did anyone understand how many small threads she had been holding together? Or would the company continue moving forward, never realizing what had quietly disappeared back at the office? Someone else was beginning to notice. His name was Daniel Brooks. And unlike most employees, Daniel paid close attention to systems. Because Daniel worked in IT, and IT people tend to see patterns others miss. Over the past week, Daniel had watched something unusual happen. Calendar conflicts, missing emails, documents that should have been shared but weren't. None of these problems seemed serious on their own. But together, they formed a pattern that began exactly 2 weeks earlier. The day Margaret Hill left the company, Daniel leaned back in his chair, staring at the calendar system on his screen. Then he quietly said something that no one else in the office had said yet. Maybe she wasn't just the secretary. He didn't know it yet. But that thought was the first step toward uncovering the truth. And the more Daniel looked into it, the more he would realize that Margaret Hill had not simply worked at the company. For 30 years, she had been the reason it worked at all. The strange thing about Margaret Hill was that most people in the office thought they knew her. They knew she was polite. They knew she arrived early. They knew she never raised her voice and never seemed to be in a hurry. But the truth was, very few people actually knew Margaret's story, because Margaret had never talked about it. Not in meetings, not during coffee breaks, not even during the small birthday gatherings the office occasionally held in the break room. To most of her co-workers, Margaret had always simply been there, steady, reliable, almost invisible. But 30 years earlier, Margaret Hill had walked into that same office for a very different reason. Back then, she was not the calm, quiet woman everyone knew. She was frightened, exhausted, and trying to rebuild a life that had suddenly fallen apart 3 decades earlier. Margaret had been married. Her husband, David, worked as a delivery driver for a regional logistics company. They lived in a small apartment on the edge of town. It wasn't much, but it was enough. David had a warm laugh. Margaret liked to say that he could make an entire room smile without even trying. And together, they had a son, a little boy named Lucas. Lucas had David's eyes and Margaret's patience. For a while, life felt stable, predictable, safe, until one evening when everything changed. David never came home from work. A storm had rolled through the area that afternoon. The roads were slick. The accident report would later describe it in careful, technical language. But Margaret only remembered the phone call, the silence on the other end before the officer spoke, and the moment when the world she knew quietly disappeared. Suddenly, Margaret was alone, avido, with a young child, and bills that didn't stop arriving simply because life had become unbearable. For a few weeks, she tried to hold everything together. She sold a few belongings. She delayed payments where she could. But eventually, the reality became impossible to ignore. Margaret needed a job. Any job. And that's how she found the small administrative position at Hill & Carter Industries. It wasn't a glamorous role. The listing simply said, "Office assistant, needed administrative support." But Margaret walked into the interview, determined to make it work. The office looked different back then. Smaller, less polished. The company had only a few departments and a handful of clients. Margaret sat across from the hiring manager, holding her resume with slightly trembling hands. The manager glanced at her work history. "You don't have much office experience," he said. Margaret nodded honestly. "No." Then she added quietly, "But I learned quickly." There was something in her voice that made the manager pause. Perhaps it was determination, or perhaps it was simply the calm steadiness of someone who had already survived something much harder than a job interview. Either way, the manager eventually nodded. "We'll give you a chance." Margaret never forgot that moment, because from that day forward, she decided something very important. She would never waste that chance. Margaret worked harder than anyone expected. She arrived early. She stayed late when necessary. She asked questions until she understood every part of the job. Slowly, she began to learn how the company functioned. At first, it was simple things: answering phones, scheduling meetings, preparing documents. But Margaret had a quiet talent. She paid attention to details, to patterns, to the way problems often began long before anyone else noticed them. Over time, she started remembering small things. Which client preferred morning calls? Which executive tended to forget attachments in emails? Which deadlines mattered most? She wrote everything down in her notebook, page after page of careful observations. Not because anyone told her to, but because she believed something deeply. If she could take care of the small things, everyone else could focus on the big ones. Years passed. Lucas grew older. The company grew too. More employees joined. New departments appeared. And through it all, Margaret remained at the same desk near the entrance of the office floor. Many people assumed that meant she had never advanced in her career. But they misunderstood something important. Margaret didn't stay in that position because she lacked ability. She stayed because she understood something about the company that others did not. From that desk, she could see everything. She saw who arrived early, who rushed into meetings unprepared, which conversations happened quietly in the hallway, and which decisions would eventually affect the entire business. Her desk became something like a quiet control tower, a place where dozens of small decisions passed every day, and Margaret guided many of them gently in the right direction. Most people never noticed, because when a problem is prevented, it rarely becomes visible. One evening, many years ago, Margaret was the last person left in the office. The building was almost completely dark. Only the light above her desk remained on. She was reviewing a stack of contract documents, scheduled for a signing the next morning. A major agreement with a logistics partner, one that could change the company's future. As Margaret read through the pages, something made her pause. A number. One small figure buried deep inside the contract. At first glance, it looked normal. But Margaret had reviewed enough agreements to sense when something didn't feel right. She read the line again, and then a third time. Her stomach tightened slightly. If that number remained unchanged, the company could lose a significant amount of money. Margaret looked at the clock. It was already past 9. Everyone else had gone home hours earlier. For a moment, she considered leaving it for the morning. After all, this wasn't technically her responsibility. But Margaret closed the folder slowly, then opened her notebook, and began reviewing the client's previous contracts. One by one, page after page. She worked late into the night, rechecking numbers, rewriting sections, preparing corrected documents. By the time the cleaning crew arrived the next morning, Margaret was still sitting at her desk. When the contract signing took place later that day, everything went smoothly. The deal was completed. The executives celebrated. No one ever knew how close the company had come to a serious financial mistake. And Margaret never told them. She simply returned to her desk and continued working. That night, when she finally arrived home, Lucas, now a teenager, looked up from the kitchen table. "You're late," he said. Margaret smiled. "Busy day." Lucas watched her for a moment, then asked a simple question. "Mom, why do you work so hard if no one even notices?" Margaret paused before answering. She set her bag down on the table and looked at her son. Then she said something he would remember for the rest of his life. "Because doing the right thing isn't about being noticed." Lucas frowned slightly. "Then what is it about, Margaret?" Smiled gently. "It's about knowing you did it." From that day forward, Margaret followed a simple belief. One she rarely spoke aloud, but one that shaped every day of her career. "If I do my job quietly, everything will be fine." And for 30 years, that belief seemed to be true, until the morning she walked into conference room A, and everything changed. Because now, without Margaret in the building, the quiet system she had maintained for decades was beginning to unravel, and someone inside the company was finally starting to notice. At first, Daniel Brooks thought the problems were just technical glitches. That was his job. After all, when something didn't work, people called IT. And during the 2 weeks after Margaret left the company, Daniel had received more calls than usual. Calendar errors, missing meeting invitations, emails that should have been forwarded but weren't, documents no one could locate. None of these problems were dramatic. They were small, but Daniel had worked in IT long enough to know something important. Small problems rarely appear alone. They travel in patterns. Daniel sat in his chair one afternoon, staring at the company's scheduling system. Rows of meeting entries filled the screen. Some were correctly organized, others weren't. A conference room had been double booked. A client call had been scheduled without the correct documents attached. And one executive had completely missed an important meeting that morning because the reminder notification never arrived. Daniel rubbed his forehead. "Strange," he muttered. He began scrolling through older records. Not hours, not days, weeks. That's when he noticed something unusual. The problems didn't begin gradually. They began suddenly, exactly 14 days earlier. Daniel checked the date again, then leaned back in his chair. 14 days ago. That was the day Margaret Hill left the company. Across the office floor, people were beginning to feel the same uneasiness. Thomas, one of the senior project managers, stood near the break room holding a folder. "Has anyone seen the Westbrook files?" he asked. 3 employees looked up from their desks. "No idea. I thought you had them. Maybe accounting has them." Thomas frowned. They were supposed to be ready this morning. The meeting with Westbrook Logistics began 15 minutes later. Without the files, the client remained polite, but their tone carried a hint of concern. After the call ended, Thomas leaned back in his chair and sighed. Then he said something almost absent-mindedly. Margaret would have had those ready. No one responded, but a few people quietly nodded. Later that same afternoon, another issue appeared. The finance department discovered a renewal notice that should have been sent to a long-term client 2 days earlier. Without that notice, the contract had temporarily expired. It wasn't a disaster, but it created complications. More paperwork, more explanations, and more frustration. When the finance manager mentioned it in a meeting, someone at the table said the same sentence again. Margaret used to track these things. The room fell silent for a moment. Then the meeting continued, but the thought lingered in the air. Over the next few days, the same pattern repeated. A shipment schedule was confirmed late. A client called asking for information that no one seemed able to locate. and an executive arrived at a conference room, only to discover the meeting had been moved without anyone telling him. Individually, each issue seemed minor, but together they created something harder to ignore. An uncomfortable sense that the office had lost its rhythm. Daniel noticed it most clearly, because his job required him to observe how information moved through the company. And lately, information was getting lost. Not completely, just enough to cause confusion. He opened another report on his screen, then another, then another. A timeline began forming in his mind. Before Margaret left, the systems worked almost perfectly. After she left, small errors appeared every day. Daniel leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. Then he whispered something that no one else in the office had said out loud yet. Maybe she wasn't just the secretary. That evening, Daniel stayed late. The office lights dimmed one by one as employees went home. The cleaning crew moved quietly through the hallway. Daniel continued studying the system logs, emails, calendar activity, shared documents. Eventually, he noticed something interesting. Many of the reminders and scheduling adjustments that used to appear automatically had actually been entered manually. By Margaret. Not by software. Not by managers. By Margaret. For years. Quietly. Consistently. Daniel opened the personnel directory and stared at Margaret's old profile. There it was. Her job title, Administrative Secretary. Daniel shook his head slowly. That's not what she was, he said softly. The next morning brought another complication. A major client called unexpectedly. They were preparing to finalize a large contract, but they needed clarification on several details first. Normally, Margaret would have already prepared a summary of the client's preferences, but now no one seemed sure where that information had been stored. Thomas walked over to Daniel's desk. Do you know where Margaret kept the Westbrook client notes? Daniel looked up. I don't think they're in the system. Thomas frowned. What do you mean? Daniel hesitated. Then he said the words that made Thomas pause. I think Margaret kept some things in her own records. Thomas leaned against the desk. You're telling me our biggest client information wasn't in the system? Daniel nodded slowly. I'm saying Margaret probably knew things that the system didn't. Thomas stared across the office floor. For the first time, a new possibility entered his mind. What if the company had misunderstood Margaret's role entirely? What if she had been doing far more than anyone realized? Later that day, Daniel opened a spreadsheet and began compiling something. A list. Every missed meeting. Every delayed contract. Every document that had gone missing in the last 2 weeks. The list grew longer than he expected. Then Daniel added one more column. A simple note beside each problem, handled previously by Margaret. By the time he finished, the pattern was impossible to ignore. Daniel leaned back in his chair, and for a long moment, he simply stared at the screen, because he was beginning to understand something that no one else in the company had fully realized yet. Margaret Hill hadn't just worked at Hill and Carter Industries. For 30 years, she had quietly kept the entire place running. And without her, the cracks were finally starting to show. The only question now was this: would anyone in leadership be willing to admit it? Or would the company continue pretending that losing Margaret had never mattered at all? Daniel closed his laptop slowly, because he had already made a decision. If no one else was going to ask the question, he would. And that decision would soon lead him somewhere unexpected. To a quiet house, with a small garden, and a woman who had spent 30 years holding an entire company together without anyone noticing. The following Saturday morning was unusually quiet. Not just in the office, but everywhere. A soft spring sun filtered through the clouds, casting gentle light across the quiet streets of Margaret's neighborhood. Margaret stood in her garden, carefully watering the rose bushes along the wooden fence. She had always liked mornings like this. Slow, peaceful. For the first time in 30 years, she didn't have to think about meeting schedules or incoming client calls. No phones ringing, no hurried footsteps in the hallway. Just the sound of water flowing from the hose and the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. On the small patio table beside her rested the familiar brown leather notebook she had carried to work every day. It was open. A pen lay across the pages. Margaret had tried not to look at it too often since leaving the office. But old habits were hard to forget. Sometimes she still found herself writing small notes in the margins. A reminder, an observation, even though no one in the company would ever read them again. Or so she thought. Across town, Daniel Brooks sat in his car, staring at the address written on a piece of paper. He had hesitated before coming. More than once. Driving to a former employee's home wasn't exactly part of his job description, but the more he reviewed the company's recent problems, the more convinced he became of something. Margaret had known things, important things, and if the company was going to recover before losing more clients, someone needed to talk to her. Daniel checked the address one more time. Then he stepped out of the car and walked slowly up the small path toward the house. The garden immediately caught his attention. Rows of roses, lavender plants swaying lightly in the wind. Everything carefully maintained. Everything peaceful. It was the opposite of the chaotic atmosphere that had begun forming back at the office. Margaret noticed him approaching and turned slightly. For a moment she looked surprised. Then she recognized the young man. "Daniel," she said. Daniel smiled politely. "Good morning, Margaret." She placed the watering hose aside. "I didn't expect visitors today." Daniel nodded. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything." Margaret glanced around the quiet garden. "No," she said gently. "Just the roses." They sat at the small patio table. Daniel noticed the notebook immediately. The same one Margaret had carried every day at the office. He remembered seeing it beside her keyboard countless times. Margaret followed his gaze. "Oh," she said softly. "That old thing?" Daniel smiled. "You wrote in it constantly." Margaret nodded. "Just small reminders." Daniel leaned forward slightly. Reminders about what Margaret hesitated. Then she opened the notebook. The pages were filled with neat handwriting. Dates, client names, meeting notes, small details that looked insignificant at first glance. But as Daniel read the pages, his expression slowly changed. There were notes about Westbrook Logistics, information about Northern Supply, contract renewal reminders, personal preferences of long-term clients, even warnings about potential scheduling conflicts weeks in advance. Daniel flipped another page, and another. Each page revealed more of the same. Careful observations, quiet preparations. Margaret had documented years of knowledge inside that notebook, things the company system had never recorded. Daniel finally looked up. "You kept track of all of this yourself?" Margaret shrugged slightly. "Someone had to." Daniel ran his hand through his hair. "You realize the company is struggling right now?" Margaret's expression softened. "I suspected that might happen." Daniel blinked. "You knew?" Margaret nodded slowly. "Not because the company is weak," she said, "but because people depend on routines more than they realize." She closed the notebook gently. When routines disappear suddenly, things fall apart for a while. Daniel leaned back in his chair. Things are already falling apart. Margaret studied his face for a moment. How bad? Daniel hesitated. Then he answered honestly, "We've already lost 2 clients." Margaret sighed quietly. "I was afraid of that." Daniel placed his hands on the table. "Margaret, the company needs help." Margaret looked toward the rose bushes for a moment. Then she said something simple. I'm not surprised. Daniel frowned slightly. Does that bother you? Margaret shook her head. No. She paused, then added softly. I spent 30 years trying to keep things running smoothly. Daniel watched her carefully. And now Margaret looked back at him. Now I'm learning how to grow roses. Daniel laughed quietly. I'm serious. I know, Margaret said. But Daniel, I'm not angry. Daniel tilted his head. You should be. Margaret thought about that for a moment. Then she smiled gently. Being angry doesn't fix anything. Daniel glanced down at the notebook again. Without this information, we're flying blind. Margaret rested her hands on the table. That notebook helped me remember things. Daniel raised an eyebrow, but it helped the company run. Margaret considered his words. Then she said something thoughtful. Maybe? Daniel leaned forward again. What if the company asked you to come back? Margaret didn't answer immediately. Instead, she picked up the notebook and slowly turned a few pages. 30 years of notes. 30 years of quiet responsibility. Finally, she looked up. Daniel, she said calmly. Why would they do that? Daniel held her gaze. Because they're starting to realize something. Margaret waited. Daniel spoke slowly. The company didn't just lose a secretary. He tapped the notebook gently. They lost the person who understood how everything worked. Margaret said nothing. But for the first time since leaving the office, she looked thoughtful. Because somewhere deep down, she already knew that might be true. And if the company truly understood that, then a very different conversation might soon take place. One that Margaret had never expected. And one that would force the leadership of Hill and Carter Industries to face a difficult truth. Sometimes, the most important people in an organization are the ones no one notices. Until they're gone. Monday morning arrived with a tension that no one in the office could quite explain. It wasn't chaos. Not yet. But something felt different. The kind of quiet tension that spreads through a workplace when too many small things have gone wrong. Phones rang a little more urgently. Managers walked faster through the hallways. People checked their calendars twice instead of once. At Noah Chinchi M. The executive conference room began filling with department heads. Thomas from project management, Rachel from finance, 2 directors from operations, and finally, Daniel Brooks from IT. Daniel rarely attended meetings like this, but today was different. Today, he had something the others needed to see. The room settled into an uneasy silence. The senior director, Mr. Carter, looked around the table. Let's begin, he said. Rachel from finance spoke first. We've lost 2 clients in the last 2 weeks, she reported. Both mentioned delays in communication. Thomas added quietly. And the Westbrook meeting nearly collapsed last week. Mr. Carter frowned. That's not acceptable. Everyone agreed, but no one yet understood why it was happening. Daniel cleared his throat slightly. I may have found something, he said. Several people turned toward him. Daniel connected his laptop to the screen at the end of the conference table. A large spreadsheet appeared. Rows of data. Dates. Events. Missed reminders. Delayed documents. I started tracking operational disruptions over the past 2 weeks, Daniel explained. Thomas leaned forward, and Daniel pointed to the first column. Every one of these problems started after the same date. He clicked the next slide. A calendar appeared on the screen. A red circle surrounded a single day. The day Margaret Hill left the company. The room fell silent. Mr. Carter frowned slightly. You're suggesting our issues began when the secretary left. Daniel nodded calmly. I'm suggesting we underestimated her role. Some of the executives exchanged skeptical looks. One of them spoke. She handled scheduling. Daniel nodded. Yes. Then he clicked another slide. This time, the screen showed a list of client communications. Margaret also maintained client preference notes. Daniel said, "Many of those notes weren't stored in our system." Rachel crossed her arms. "What do you mean they weren't stored?" Daniel answered carefully. "They were stored somewhere else." Later that afternoon, Daniel drove back to Margaret's house. He had asked if he could borrow the notebook. Margaret had hesitated at first, not because she didn't trust him, but because that notebook represented 30 years of quiet responsibility. Eventually, she handed it to him. "Just bring it back," she said. Now Daniel placed the notebook gently on the conference table. It looked ordinary. A brown leather cover, slightly worn at the edges, but when Daniel opened it, the room became very quiet. Page after page revealed something remarkable. Client histories, meeting preparations, deadline reminders, contract notes, handwritten observations about how the company actually functioned. Rachel leaned closer. "You kept all this?" Daniel nodded. Margaret did. "Mr." Carter flipped a few pages himself. His expression slowly changed. "How long has she been keeping these records?" Daniel answered simply. 30 years. No one spoke for several seconds. Because suddenly the pattern made sense. The smoothness the company had enjoyed for decades had never been automatic. It had been carefully maintained. By Margaret. Thomas leaned back in his chair. "I thought we had a system for this." Daniel shook his head gently. "We had Margaret." The words hung in the air, and for the first time since Margaret left, the leadership team began to understand the real problem. They hadn't removed a small administrative role. They had removed the person who quietly connected dozens of moving parts. And now those parts were drifting apart. "Mr." Carter closed the notebook slowly. "Where is she now?" he asked. Daniel answered, "At home." "Has anyone contacted her?" Daniel hesitated. "Not officially." "Mr. Carter, Seahild. Then perhaps we should." Rachel frowned slightly. "You're suggesting we bring her back?" Carter looked around the table. "What I'm suggesting," he said carefully, "is that we correct a mistake." Across town, Margaret sat in her garden again. The afternoon sun warmed the wooden table beside her. The notebook was missing now. For the first time in years, she felt strangely unburdened. Lucas, her son, now an adult, had called earlier that morning. "How are you doing without the office?" he asked. Margaret smiled as she remembered the conversation. "Peaceful," she told him. "Do you miss it?" Margaret thought for a moment before answering. "I miss the people," she admitted, "but life changes." Lucas laughed softly. "You always say that." Margaret looked out across the garden. "Yes," she said, "because it's usually true." Just then, Margaret heard the faint sound of a car stopping outside the house. She looked up. A familiar vehicle. Daniel stepped out. Margaret walked toward the gate. "You came back quickly," she said with a smile. Daniel nodded. "They've seen the notebook." Margaret studied his face, and Daniel took a breath. "They finally understand." Margaret didn't seem surprised. "Understanding often comes late," she said quietly. Daniel nodded. "That's why I'm here." Margaret waited. Daniel spoke carefully. "The leadership team would like to meet with you." Margaret looked toward the garden again. The roses moved gently in the wind. 30 years of memories sat quietly behind those words. Finally, she asked one simple question. About what? Daniel answered honestly. "About fixing the company." Margaret was silent for a moment. Then she said something thoughtful. "Fixing a company takes more than one person." Daniel smiled slightly. "I think they're beginning to understand that." Margaret considered the invitation. Then she nodded slowly. All right. But as Daniel walked back to his car, Margaret remained standing beside the garden, looking down at the empty space where her notebook had been, because something inside her told her that the next meeting would not be the same as the last one. This time, the conversation would be very different, and for the first time in 30 years, Margaret Hill would no longer be the quietest person in the room. 2 days later, Margaret Hill walked back into the building she had left behind. The glass doors looked exactly the same. The reception desk, the elevator, even the faint hum of the air conditioning felt familiar. For 30 years, this place had been part of her daily rhythm. Now she stood in the lobby again. But the feeling was different. Not bitter, not angry, just distant. Like visiting a house where you once lived a very long time ago. Alan, the security guard, looked up from his desk. His eyes widened immediately. Margaret. She smiled gently. Good morning. Alan. He stood up quickly. I heard you might come back. Margaret nodded. Just for a meeting. Alan shook his head slowly. Well, things haven't been the same since you left. Margaret didn't respond to that. She simply gave him the same warm smile she had given him every morning for 30 years. Then she stepped into the elevator. When the elevator doors opened on the 4th floor, several employees noticed her right away. Conversations paused. A few whispers moved quietly across the room. Is that Margaret? She came back. Maybe they rehired her. Margaret greeted people with small nods as she walked through the office. No drama. No tension. Just the quiet presence everyone had grown used to over the years. Daniel met her near the conference room. Thank you for coming, he said. Margaret placed her handbag beside a chair. You said the company needed help. Daniel nodded. They're inside. The leadership team sat around the large conference table. Mr. Carter, Rachel from finance, Thomas from operations. Several directors who had rarely spoken directly with Margaret before. Now every one of them watched as she entered. Mr. Carter stood up. Margaret, thank you for meeting with us. Margaret nodded politely and sat down. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Mr. Carter said the words that had clearly taken time to prepare. We believe we made a mistake. Margaret waited quietly. Rachel added, in the past 2 weeks, we've realized how much work you were quietly managing. Thomas leaned forward. Things have been difficult. Margaret listened calmly. No anger, no visible satisfaction, just quiet attention. Finally, Mr. Carter asked, would you be willing to help stabilize operations? Margaret looked around the room. Then she spoke with the same calm voice everyone remembered. Let's focus on fixing the company first. Personal matters can come later. The room grew still. Several executives had expected negotiation, perhaps even resentment. But Margaret wasn't interested in that conversation yet. She reached for the stack of documents Daniel had prepared. Show me what's broken, she said. Over the next few hours, something remarkable happened. Margaret began working, not dramatically, not loudly, but with the quiet precision she had practiced for 3 decades. She reviewed the meeting schedules, adjusted several conflicting appointments, reorganized the document folders. She made 3 short phone calls to longtime clients. Each conversation began the same way. Hello. This is Margaret from Hill and Carter. And each time the response was almost identical. Margaret, we were wondering what happened. Her voice remained warm and steady. We're putting things back in order. The reassurance worked. By mid-afternoon, 2 delayed projects were back on schedule. A client meeting was rescheduled smoothly, and a missing contract file was located in a storage folder no one else had thought to check. Employees began noticing something. The same feeling they had taken for granted for years. The office was becoming calm again, not because of a new system, not because of new leadership, but because Margaret was quietly reconnecting the threads that held everything together. Daniel watched the change unfold with quiet amazement. It was like watching a conductor guide an orchestra back into rhythm. No dramatic gestures, just small corrections. And suddenly the music made sense again. By the end of the day, most of the urgent issues had been resolved. The tension that had filled the office for 2 weeks had begun to disappear. People spoke a little more calmly. Meetings ran on time again. The building felt balanced. For the first time since Margaret left, later that evening, Margaret returned to the conference room. The leadership team was waiting. This time, there were no stacks of documents, no urgent problems, just a quiet room. Margaret sat down calmly. "Well," she said, "the company is stable again." Mr. Carter nodded slowly. "Yes, thanks to you." Margaret folded her hands on the table. For a moment, she simply looked around the room. Then she spoke again. Her voice was still gentle, but now it carried something different, clarity. "Now we can talk about what needs to happen, so this situation never repeats itself." The executives exchanged glances, because everyone in that room understood something now. Margaret had not returned to demand recognition. She had returned to fix the company first. But now, the conversation was about to change, because the quiet woman who had spent 30 years protecting the company's stability was finally going to protect her own. And this time, everyone in the room was ready to listen. The room stayed quiet for several seconds. No one interrupted, because the tone in Margaret's voice had changed. Not harsh, not demanding, but firm in a way that made people sit a little straighter in their chairs. "Mr. Carter leaned forward. "What do you have in mind?" Margaret took a slow breath. For 30 years, she had rarely asked for anything. Not recognition, not promotion, not even acknowledgement. But the past few weeks had changed something. Not her kindness, but her understanding of her own value. She spoke calmly. "If I return to work with the company, we need to build a structure that protects both sides." Rachel from finance nodded slightly. "That sounds reasonable." Margaret continued. "There are a few conditions I would like us to discuss." No one objected. In fact, several executives seemed almost relieved, because after witnessing the chaos of the past weeks, they understood something they had never fully appreciated before. Margaret wasn't just another employee. She was the memory of the company, the quiet structure behind its daily rhythm. Margaret folded her hands on the table. Her voice remained soft, but every word was clear. "I'm willing to come back, but I need a more stable agreement, better compensation, and clear protection in the contract, so both sides can trust the future." The words hung in the air, not emotional, not dramatic, just practical and deeply fair. Mr. Carter nodded slowly. "Go on." Margaret raised one finger. "First, no employee who has served the company faithfully for decades should be dismissed suddenly without a valid reason." Several people exchanged glances, because everyone in the room knew exactly what she meant. Margaret continued calmly. "There must be a clear policy protecting long-term employees from abrupt termination." No one argued. She raised a second finger. "Second, my role should reflect the experience I bring." Thomas frowned slightly. "What kind of role are you suggesting?" Margaret answered, without hesitation. "An operational advisory position with authority to oversee scheduling systems, documentation flow, and client coordination." Daniel looked almost relieved. That was exactly what the company needed. Rachel added quietly, "That would actually solve several structural issues." Margaret continued. Third, if the company ever decides to terminate the agreement again, the contract should include a severance guarantee. Mr. Carter leaned back slightly. What kind of guarantee? Margaret answered gently. 6 to 12 months of compensation. Silence followed. Not shock, just careful consideration. Margaret spoke again before anyone could object. Stability creates loyalty, and loyalty protects institutions. No one in the room could really disagree with that. She raised her final point. Fourth, the position should include appropriate benefits. She spoke calmly. Health coverage, reasonable vacation time, performance bonuses when the company succeeds, and flexible scheduling when necessary. Then she added quietly, these are not demands. They are safeguards. Daniel noticed something interesting. Margaret never once raised her voice. She never sounded resentful. She simply spoke as someone who finally understood her worth. The leadership team began discussing the proposal. Numbers were mentioned. Budget concerns surfaced. Thomas questioned whether the severance clause might set a precedent. Rachel pointed out that losing Margaret had already cost the company far more. Daniel quietly showed them the data. Missed meetings, delayed contracts, client complaints, 2 nearly lost partnerships, all within just 2 weeks. Finally, Mr. Carter hid. He looked across the table at Margaret. 30 years, he said softly. Yes, Margaret replied. Mr. Carter nodded. Then it seems fair that the next chapter should look different. He extended his hand across the table. We accept your conditions. Margaret looked at his hand for a moment. Then she shook it, not triumphantly, just respectfully. Because this moment wasn't about victory. It was about balance. 2 days later, Margaret returned to the office officially. But this time, the small desk near the entrance was empty. Instead, a new workspace had been prepared, near a large window, with natural light filling the room. Daniel noticed the symbolic shift immediately. For decades, Margaret had worked quietly at the edge of the office. Now she sat where everyone could see her. Not as a secretary, but as someone whose experience shaped the way the company moved forward. And yet, the most powerful moment was still waiting. Because a week later, the company would host one of its most important client meetings of the year. And during that meeting, something would happen that had never happened in 30 years. For the first time, the entire room would stand up for Margaret Hill. A week later, the conference room was filled again. This time, the tension was different. Not panic, not confusion, just anticipation. The company was about to meet with Greenwood Logistics, one of their largest and oldest clients. Losing this contract would have been devastating. But thanks to the work Margaret had quietly done over the past few days, the situation had stabilized. Files were organized. Schedules were corrected. Communication had been restored. Still, everyone in the room understood how close they had come to losing everything. Margaret arrived early, just as she always had. She placed a folder neatly on the table and reviewed the meeting agenda. Daniel walked in a few minutes later. You ready for this? He asked with a small smile. Margaret nodded. I've been ready for 30 years. Daniel laughed softly. But there was truth in her words. For 3 decades, Margaret had prepared for meetings just like this. Only this time, people were finally paying attention. The Greenwood executives entered shortly after. Handshakes were exchanged. Coffee was poured. Everyone took their seats. For a moment, the room felt almost ordinary again. But Daniel noticed something. Several of the Greenwood representatives looked directly at Margaret. One of them smiled warmly. Margaret, he said, it's good to see you again. Margaret returned the smile. "Thank you for coming." The meeting began. Mr. Carter presented the company's recovery plan. Rachel reviewed the financial adjustments. Thomas outlined operational improvements. But every time a detailed question came up, eyes slowly turned toward Margaret. And every time, she answered calmly, precise, clear, without hesitation. The Greenwood team nodded repeatedly. It was obvious. They trusted her. Not the presentations. Not the charts. Margaret. Nearly an hour passed. The atmosphere in the room had changed. The tension was gone. Instead, there was a quiet confidence. Finally, the Greenwood director closed his folder. He looked around the room thoughtfully. Then he asked a question. A simple question, but one that no one in the company had ever really asked out loud. Who has been keeping this company running all these years? The room fell silent. No one spoke immediately, because everyone in that room knew the answer. But for some reason, it had taken 30 years for anyone to say it. Daniel slowly turned his head. His eyes moved toward Margaret. She sat quietly near the window, her notebook resting calmly on the table, not expecting recognition, not asking for it, just doing the work she had always done. Daniel finally spoke. His voice was steady. "Margaret." Every head in the room turned toward her. For a moment, Margaret looked almost surprised. Then something happened that had never happened before. One of the Greenwood executives stood up. Then another. Then another. Within seconds, the entire Greenwood team was on their feet, applauding. Not politely, not out of obligation, but with genuine respect. The sound filled the room. And then, something even more unexpected happened. One by one, the employees of Hill and Carter stood up too. Daniel, Rachel, Thomas, even Mr. Carter. The applause grew louder. 30 years of quiet work. 30 years of invisible responsibility. 30 years of keeping everything together. Finally recognized. Margaret didn't stand. She remained seated, looking slightly overwhelmed by the moment. Then she smiled softly, not proudly, just gratefully. When the applause finally settled, the Greenwood director spoke again. "Well," he said with a warm smile, "now we understand why everything fell apart when she left." A few people laughed gently, but the truth behind the words was unmistakable. Mr. Carter cleared his throat. Then he said something he should have said a long time ago. "Margaret Hill has officially joined our leadership team as operations advisor." He turned toward her. "And we're very fortunate she agreed to come back." Margaret nodded quietly. "Thank you." The meeting concluded shortly after, but the feeling in the room lingered, because everyone present understood something important now. Success rarely belongs only to the people whose names appear on the door. Sometimes, it belongs to the person who quietly keeps everything working behind the scenes. The person who remembers the details. The person who shows up every morning before anyone else arrives. The person who never asks for applause, until the day the entire room realizes they deserved it all along. Later that afternoon, Daniel stopped by Margaret's new desk near the window. Sunlight poured across the papers in front of her. She was already reviewing next week's schedules. Just like always. Daniel smiled. "You know something," he said. Margaret looked up. "What?" "For 30 years. This company ran because of you." Margaret shook her head gently. "No," she said. "It ran because people worked together." Daniel thought about that for a moment. Then he smiled again. "Maybe," he said, "but I think we finally understand something." Margaret tilted her head slightly. "What's that?" Daniel answered quietly. "Some of the most important people in any organization are the ones nobody notices until they're gone. Margaret returned to her notes. The office outside the window moved with calm. Steady rhythm again. Meetings. Phone calls. Quiet productivity. Everything flowing smoothly. Just like it had for 30 years. And for the first time in a very long time, everyone in the building finally knew why. In the days after the Greenwood meeting, something subtle began to change inside the company. Not a dramatic change. No announcements. No celebration banners in the hallway. Just a quiet shift in the atmosphere. For the first time in weeks, the office felt steady again. Phones rang. Printers hummed softly. Meetings began and ended on time. People walked through the hallways without the nervous tension that had filled the building not long ago. It was the same company. The same desks. The same fluorescent lights above the workstations. But the rhythm had returned. And everyone seemed to know why. Margaret arrived early on Monday morning, just as she had done for 30 years. The sun had barely risen when she unlocked the office door. The building was quiet, almost peaceful. She placed her handbag beside the new desk near the window. For a moment, she simply stood there. The sunlight spilled across the surface of the desk, illuminating a single object resting in the center. Her notebook, the same kind she had used for decades. Simple, leather-bound, filled with careful handwriting. For years, those notebooks had been invisible to everyone around her. But now people understood something. Those pages had quietly carried the memory of the company. Every client, every schedule, every tiny detail that allowed the organization to move forward without chaos. Margaret sat down and opened the notebook. A blank page waited. She picked up her pen and wrote the date. Then she paused for a moment. The office outside the window slowly came to life. Employees arriving, coffee cups in hand, conversations starting quietly near the break room. Normal sounds, ordinary sounds. But to Margaret, they felt meaningful, because normalcy is often something we only notice after it disappears. Daniel arrived shortly after. He walked past Margaret's desk and stopped. "You're here early again," he said. Margaret smiled faintly. Old habits. Daniel leaned against the edge of the desk. For a moment he looked around the office. Everything seemed calm, organized, balanced. "You know," he said slowly, "I think the entire company finally understands something now." Margaret glanced up from her notebook. "What's that?" Daniel folded his arms. "That stability isn't something you can buy with software or management strategies." Margaret listened quietly. Daniel continued. "Sometimes it comes from someone who simply shows up every day and keeps everything connected." Margaret looked down at the notebook again. Then she said gently, "Organizations are like families." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "How so?" Margaret smiled softly. "In a family, everyone sees the loud moments. Birthdays, celebrations, arguments, but the real strength of a family often comes from the quiet things." Daniel waited. Margaret continued writing in her notebook as she spoke. The meals someone cooks every day. The bills someone remembers to pay. The small responsibilities that keep life moving forward. She closed the notebook lightly. "Most people don't notice those things," she said, "until they stop happening." Daniel nodded slowly. Because that was exactly what the company had experienced. For years, Margaret's work had been invisible. But when it disappeared, everything else began to unravel. Later that afternoon, Mr. Carter walked past Margaret's desk. He stopped for a moment. There was something slightly hesitant in his expression. "Margaret," he said. She looked up. "Yes," he cleared his throat. "I've been thinking about something." Margaret waited. Mr. Carter looked around the office. Employees working calmly. Phones ringing. Meetings starting on time. Then he looked back at her. "For 30 years, he said slowly, "you carried a lot of responsibility here." Margaret didn't respond immediately, because she had never thought about her work that way. "Mr. Carter continued, "and I should have said something long ago." Margaret tilted her head slightly. "What's that, Mr.?" Carter took a small breath. "Thank you." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of many years. Margaret smiled. "You're welcome." And with that, Mr. Carter returned to his office. As the afternoon sunlight shifted across the room, Margaret noticed something new. Employees were stopping by her desk more often. Not because something was broken, not because something had gone wrong, but because they wanted advice. Questions about scheduling, questions about client relationships, questions about how things had been done in the past. Margaret answered each one patiently, just as she always had. But this time, people listened more carefully, because now they understood that experience was not something easily replaced. Near the end of the day, Margaret stepped away from her desk and looked out the window. The parking lot below was filled with cars, employees leaving for the evening. Another normal workday coming to an end. She thought about the moment a few weeks earlier when she had walked out of this building with a small cardboard box. At that time, it had felt like the end of something. 30 years of quiet work, closed in a single morning. But life has a way of surprising us. Sometimes endings are not really endings. Sometimes they are moments that reveal what was hidden all along. Margaret looked down at the notebook resting on her desk. The same symbol that had once represented silent responsibility. Now it represented something else. Recognition, respect, and balance. Before leaving for the evening, Margaret wrote one final note in the notebook. A simple sentence. Not a reminder, not a schedule, just a thought. She wrote, "Stability is built quietly." Then she closed the notebook, turned off the desk lamp, and stepped out of the office. The building lights dimmed behind her. The hallway fell quiet. And outside, the evening air felt calm. For the first time in a long while, everything was exactly the way it should be. Because sometimes the strongest people in any organization are not the ones who stand in front of the room. They are the ones who sit quietly near the window, writing in a notebook, keeping everything together, one small detail at a time.